Hi, folks. Welcome to the show today. Welcome to this edition, this episode, and thanks for tuning in. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more on CIAM or Customer Identity and Access Management. And we'll be following up this show with a few more episodes. We'll be bringing some guests, like we'll be having in the next episode, Neville Mendonca, who's our senior architect, to talk a little more on the architectural aspects of CIAM. But just to take a step back and talk about the management of external identities or customer identities, it's been an interesting space. Of course, in the e-commerce space, we've had B2C around for a very long time, and for some of the largest e-commerce retailers, they have some pretty sophisticated systems to manage external identities. But for the vast majority of what I would say corporate or enterprise customers that are more, I would say B2B with some flavor of B2C, what we've seen is that in the last 12 to 18 months in particular, I guess to some degree also in parallel with the pandemic, we've seen a lot of interest and increase in inquiries as well as discussions and implementations around CIAM. So, is CIAM new? No. I think external identity management has been around for quite some time. I'm seeing more and more folks use the term CIAM more actively in the corporate landscape, uh, kind of together and separate from uh, and the enterprise identity access management. So back in the day, there's a lot of discussion about the IAM strategy for customers, and kind of CIM was baked in there somewhere. What we're seeing today is as folks are maturing their enterprise identity posture or enterprise IAM strategy or enterprise IAM programs, several I would say at least medium to large size enterprises are definitely in correlation with their overall IAM strategy, are also breaking out their CIAM strategy as part of kind of the overall IAM strategy. So there's a lot of corporations or enterprise today that are looking at CIAM separately, of course, under the larger umbrella of an identity strategy, and all these things go hand in hand. But yeah, it's not a new concept, but it's definitely something that's gaining a lot of visibility in terms of corporate budgets as well as from a strategy standpoint. I'm going to say at a macro level or high level, it's kind of gaining grounds as kind of the need to have a strategy around CI, and where maybe in the past, in a number of enterprises, this was a little more, I'm going to say, fragmented or one off, maybe based on business units. Certain business units had their own identity need for having external identities and their own external facing applications. Today, we're seeing more and more CIOs and even and chief security officers maybe concerned or more focused on having a unified strategy even on the customer or external front. Now, going to external identities as kind of the landscape today or how it's been, what we've seen over the last decade and a half in the identity space when it came to exposing applications to the external world as well as having external identities separate from the FTE staff or contractor workforce that's typically in your HR systems in many companies. uh, it's been pretty fragmented or organic in terms of the way the landscape has progressed. So for example, it's not at all uncommon to find a company that has an external facing application that has its own username and password and own onboarding process. And then over the years, through mergers and acquisitions, you have a bit of a patchwork of systems where you have different business units having different external facing applications. And all of a sudden, you have a situation where you kind of have this sprawling enterprise where you have one pretty large enterprise identity presence. And then when you go into the external facing identities, it becomes kind of a little bit of a patchwork or hodgepodge of external identities. Now, it's not such a bad thing on its own. With the focus on security over the last few years, a lot of companies still do a very good job in terms of maintaining this kind of fragmented, let's just say, environment that may or may not exist in the B2B or B2C identity space or CIM space. But what we're seeing now is the need and focus and budgets going into management of external identities. Now, typically, management of external identities, what we've seen, there haven't been tools from a technology standpoint that have been built ground up, focused on external use cases. What we are seeing is that this is being recognized kind of as an area of opportunity for many companies, including our own. We have our own product, ORSIS EIAG, or External Identity and Access Governance, that's really been built ground up, focusing on the what I'm going to call the very elegant management of external identities or B2B partnerships. So, folks, now I talked about kind of the overall landscape as to how CIAM is viewed and kind of the focus from a corporate standpoint. Let's shift gears a little bit to the architecture and technology perspective for CIAM. We're frequently asked the question on CIAM is, hey, do you do CIAM? What tool do you have? How do you do CIAM? We need a tool to implement CIAM. Now, all of that they're all perfectly fine questions, but the truth is, there's no one tool for CIAM. Just for example, as is the case with an enterprise IAM strategy, there are obviously industry leading approaches and tools to do certain things, but it involves a certain level of knowledge, integration, and architecture. We believe the same thing applies to CIAM, probably more so, just because of the kind of just loosely the more federated nature of CIAM and the more kind of disparate nature of how CIAM has evolved in most corporate organizations. So, what we first advise when we consult on CIAM uh, projects is essentially first take a very deep look at what you have in place, and it is fairly common to find, as I said earlier, a kind of a very disparate setup of different client facing applications. Not unusual at all to find the same company requiring 3 or 4 different logons for different applications or for like different business units, though that has changed over the years. We do have companies that have kind of single sign on for different applications, but through M&A and mergers, those kind of things, we it's not uncommon still. So once you have a look at kind of what you have, really what we've seen in CIAM is there is a level of integration that needs to go in to balance the aspects of security, privacy, PI data in many jurisdictions, as well as with user experience, and then manageability or scalability, and most importantly, visibility, to get a central view, a comprehensive view of your external identities. The complexity with external identities as opposed to internal identities is that the life cycle can be quite asynchronous in a way. And I use the word asynchronous a bit loosely here, but what I mean is that very often in B2B scenarios in particular, you may have situations where external identities are onboarded and offboarded by external custodians, that is, people at partner companies that are responsible for onboarding or offboarding certain identities. And the ability for the enterprise, if you're the enterprise and you're partnering with, let's say, at scale, several hundreds of B2B organizations, becomes very difficult to figure out whether that whole process is working correctly or not. Hence, the complexity, or I would say the difference between internal and external identities, is the whole aspect of you're really dealing with a lot of things that are outside of your control. So, the aspect of governance, certification, recertification, the establishment of contracts between the two companies, that whole process of not just onboarding an identity, but onboarding an organization and setting up an organization as a B2B partner is an aspect of CIAM. Now, that is traditionally where we see a lot of organizations have put in what I would say the custom scripts or some business logic to manage external partners. So typically you'll see a lot of integration, in some cases a lot of scripts, and all of this put together to form kind of a CIM system. To form your kind of go forward CIM strategy, we highly recommend getting a very good picture of where you are, your current investments. Obviously, there's a amount of technology debt as well as technology investment that you kind of can't overlook, and you need to take that into consideration. But most importantly, what we would look at is looking towards getting a really good user experience across all of your customer identity and interactions of your various customer facing applications. So when we look at a go forward CIAM strategy, what we would highly recommend is to get a really good look at what you currently have in terms of technology investments. Obviously, most organizations that have been around for some time, there is going to be a level of technology debt as well as technology investment that is not necessarily a bad thing, but cannot be ignored and needs to be considered in terms of future budgets and investments. But what we would look at really as the cornerstones of a really good CIM strategy is, number one, an approach that's leading to centralized visibility, uh, probably being the most important thing of all your external identity ecosystem. How many external partner organizations do you have in the B2B scenario? In the B2C scenario, a really good comprehensive understanding of the number of endpoint consumer identities that you have. Layered onto that, obviously, is the aspect of having a really good user experience. Having a unified user experience is something that's been around for a while, but when you look at the B2B side of things, as well as some of the B2C side of things, where customers have a number of different client facing applications, there is an aspect of improvement or efficiency that can be gained by having a really unified and really good, smooth user experience. In addition to that, security obviously is kind of the driver right now for a lot of these budgets as well. And then in several jurisdictions, the handling of customer data as well, PII and all of the governance around that. So really, when you look at a CIM strategy from a technology standpoint, it's not really one tool. Again, the foundations apply. Having said that, we are seeing many organizations as well as technology companies starting to recognize these CIM use cases. We see a lot of a lot of usage of CIAM across the industry now. A lot of companies, as I said earlier, looking at CIAM as a kind of a distinct strategy unit between the overall, within the overall IAM strategy as a whole. And maybe this was not happening a few years ago, so that's definitely changing. We have our own product, for example, ORSUS EIAG, external identity and access governance. Now, what I really like about our product is the fact that we have the benefit of hindsight that when we developed this product, it was developed ground up, considering external identity access governance, since we had that experience of working with dozens of organizations across industry verticals where we really understood the use cases that apply. So what OSIS EIAG does really handles I would say it handles the setup of external organizations in a really elegant way. And the entire process of onboarding, the lifecycle management, the provisioning and offboarding of external identities is really handled very well. And this plugs in very well with your identity providers as well as other complementary identity technologies. Similarly, a few other products are there that need a level of integration. So overall, this space is pretty interesting. And what I would say, CIAM, the difference between CIAM strategy and the IAM strategy, you're dealing with a kind of a disparate infrastructure in CIAM. Sometimes very diverse target audiences, even within the different B2B companies or B2C kind of audiences that you're dealing with. So overall, from a CIAM strategy, we are seeing a lot of companies focus on this. I think a lot of companies are still taking initial steps in this, while some companies are more ahead in this, in kind of in their roadmap. But overall, I believe the technology in this direction, a lot of use cases are being tailored to focus on customer identity and access management. And a lot of this goes down to fundamental architecture and technology principles. Essentially, the fundamental architecture of a CIAM is very similar in certain ways to an IAM. Fundamentally, if you have something well architected for scale, it probably is going to serve you very well in the long run. So before I close out on kind of the technology aspects, I do want to talk about analytics. Now, both from an enterprise identity as well as an external identity or customer identity perspective, we believe that analytics is really where a lot of the future IAM strategies will be focused on from a perspective of visibility, security, compliance, and protecting customer data. With the introduction of AI and machine learning around the analytics, it takes on a kind of a new meaning, especially in the case of CIAM, where, as I explained earlier, the diversity and sometimes disparity between the target audiences and B2B organizations as well as B2C audiences, then the power of AI and machine learning really comes to the fore. So, in our experience, analytics in several years ago would be an afterthought in identity. Of course, there was the basic reporting from an audit and attestation kind of view. However, with the introduction of AI and machine learning, the power and the ability that you have now for the visibility and analytics, has grown exponentially. So, especially in the CIAM aspect, where you have a lot of disparate systems and organizations as well as target audiences that you're dealing with, the ability to have analytics around looking at patterns and detecting patterns from an overall compliance and security standpoint kind of becomes very critical. So I did want to conclude that any CIAM strategy, one of the pillars of that also has to be analytics, and that's kind of something that's on an ongoing basis and needs to be part of any CIM strategy. Just to kind of conclude this session on customer identity and access management, one aspect that has also come into play is, hey, what's the repository of identities? What's the source of truth? It's fairly common to have an identity store for and different organizations may name it differently. When it comes to the customer identity and access management, an identity repository, maybe many organizations would call it, dealing especially with external identities. And then organizations that have a need for kind of looking globally at internal as well as external identities have various different ways in which they achieve that. So we've done a lot of work in this space as it regards to identity stores, identity repositories, and a lot of it is dependent on the kind of architecture that you have. But going forward, from a forward-looking CIM strategy perspective, having a good idea of your different sources of identities and where you want this to reside, and what is the level of access management, and whether there needs to be any interaction with internal systems, those are kind of considerations as well that need to go into any CIM strategy. So to conclude, overall, when we look at customer identity and access management, really what we're seeing is a new focus or renewed focus in this space, uh, a real focus on security and compliance, and then also on with user experience and then scalability and manageability of the environment. So we are seeing a number of organizations starting to take the steps in a kind of a 1 to 2 or 3 year roadmap on CIAM. And once again, this varies quite a bit depending on organizations. Typically, we've seen larger organizations that have been around for a longer time and that have gone through a lot of M&A activity, or have bought out different companies or different applications, or have several different business units. The CIAM landscape tends to be a little more complex and, let's say, disparate, and in those cases sometimes the strategy takes a little longer to execute. But overall, I think the good news here is that from an executive C-level perspective, from both at the CIO and CISO level as well as the business perspective, because the business is today very well aware of the need for security as well as user experience, we're seeing a lot of focus and budgets being allocated to CIAM, and also the recognition of CIAM as kind of an integral part of having a really robust identity strategy for the organization as a whole. Now, I won't get too caught up in terminology, external identity management, customer identity and access management, but point being here is that we need to manage external identities and in the same robust way in which we've traditionally looked at internal identities. And I think the industry is there right now in terms of understanding and awareness, and would encourage folks that are looking to build a CIM strategy to kind of look at some of the aspects that we talked about, and we'd love to hear from you, of course. So feel free to reach out to us, and always great to have a conversation on this topic. And I've only covered some of these topics at a very high level. We will be going deeper into several of these topics, and we're going to have several guests on the show over the coming weeks and months. So thanks, folks, everyone, for tuning in. Really appreciate it. And from everyone at IS Squared, thank you for tuning in. Thank you.
For more information, please go to our website at www.issquaredinc.com.